Hello, Asia, and hello, world. The Great Recall in Taiwan has been considered as an unprecedented effort to recall sitting representatives in the national level legislature, with no other recall efforts worldwide having been recorded as extensive as what happened in Taiwan. On July 26, 2025, recall votes were held for 24 members of the Legislative Yuan, all members of Kuomintang or the Nationalist Party, KMT, and the smaller Taiwan People's Party form a majority bloc in the legislature. The recall efforts stemmed from the KMT TPP passing of measures that sought to expand the powers of the legislature and cuts to the annual budget, including cutting and freezing of critical national security expenditures, among others. Protest actions were launched against such moves, but seeing that these protests did not deter legislators from heeding the people's voices, civil society groups backed by the Democratic Progressive Party or DPP and individuals launched efforts against all 37 district members of KMT. For the recall to pass, more than a quarter of eligible voters in the electoral district must vote in favor of it, and the total number of supporters must exceed those voting against. The recall efforts failed, but seven more KMT legislators are facing recall votes on August 23, 2025. To supporters of the recall, the efforts reflected the vigor of Taiwan's democracy, but to opponents, the recall campaign was an abuse of a process that should be used sparingly. In this episode of the Election Observer podcast, we'll discuss what the results of the Great Recall mean for Taiwan moving forward and how the recall efforts affect the overall health of democracy in Taiwan. I'm your host, John Antiquera, and we are live via ANFREL's Facebook and LinkedIn pages, as well as via ANFREL's YouTube channel. Episodes of the Election Observer podcast can also be streamed via Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Joining us in this episode are William Yang, Senior Analyst for Northeast Asia at the International Crisis Group, and Bo Tedards, a longtime observer of the political environment in Taiwan. Hello, William and Bo. Welcome to the Election Observer podcast.
Hello, thank you, John.
Hello.
Thank you for having me.
It's nice to see the two of you. No? Let's discuss the recall mechanism first. It's not a common mechanism in democracies around the world, or at least not generally known. I know for a fact it's not. I'm not familiar with it as a Filipino. But in Taiwan, the election law is actually called the election and recall law. Why do you think the recall mechanism is a fundamental part of the electoral system in Taiwan? The question is
Well,
addressed to both of you. Yes, Bo.
yeah, it has an ancient history. It was first proposed by Sun Yat-sen, over 100 years ago, as part of his three principles of the people theories that he produced in the early 20th century when trying to um, formulate a constitutional order for, the new Republic of China. So it was put in. Then it was put into the first Republic of China Constitution in 1947 in China, right? And then which was brought by the Republic of China government to Taiwan after World War II. So it has a really ancient history, which is kind of interesting, and I guess in a way unique. Although I think, as far as I know, Sun Yat-sen was inspired by there was a popularity of recall type measures were being developed in the U.S. in the early 20th century. And I think that's where he got the idea.
Mhm. Yes, no, for context, no, particularly with um I was looking at the different texts. No, but William, would you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think, kind of like what Bo said, this goes back to the unique development of the democracy and the trajectory. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it really separates Taiwan from the rest of at least a country in this part of the world when it comes to, we know that Taiwan has long been lauded as one of the beacon of democracy in this part of Asia.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's, like democratic history, it remains relatively short, but it has built up a very robust electoral system, and there are different types of checks and balance mechanisms in place to really hold the elected representatives accountable. And I think the recall is one of those mechanisms. And I think going back to the initial design of the mechanism, I don't believe that the you know, initial batch of the lawmakers that approved it to go into the constitution viewed it as a mechanism that would have been applied in the way that it was then used in the last month Great Recall. And obviously, I think there are some very unique factors that led to what we witnessed in on July 26th.
Let's go back to the supposed reason for the Great Recall efforts about the passage of certain measures that sought to expand the powers of the legislature and sweeping cuts to the annual budget, specifically on national security expenditures. Just for context, particularly with the package of laws seeking to expand the legislature's power. The government referred the package to the Constitutional Court, which later supposedly struck down the most controversial parts of the package. But then the KMT TPP retaliated by passing measures to prevent any further constitutional interpretation. So my question is, why were these measures trigger points to go into recalling members of the legislators?
I mean, yeah, Willie, do you want to try first, or shall I go?
Yeah, you should go. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, you hinted, I think, at so there were several controversial. There's a whole wave of controversial things that the legislature, put forward in its first year. A very sort of aggressive activist approach that they took. But in theory, you have the votes in a majority. You can pass legislation quickly if you want to. But some of the things they did were really very controversial. So you mentioned the first thing was the package of expanding the legislature's own powers. So this was, it's a little bit unseemly maybe, and they rushed it through really fast, and they really, and some of the parts of it were flat unconstitutional. So the Constitutional Court, did its job as the check and balance of the situation. When there's a dispute between the executive and the legislative, the Constitutional Court should be the arbiter, the referee, right? So that's the normal system working. And so the government said, oh, we don't agree. So, okay, what can we do? We can send it to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court deliberated for a few months, come out with a ruling, which I think most legal experts thought was a fine ruling, and, and solved the problem, right? You take out some of the controversial parts, and some of the other less controversial parts can go ahead. But then when they moved to paralyze the Constitutional Court, and this I think was the thing that was most shocking, and most to many civil society groups, the reason why they had to go for the recall was because of that. So if you can't, originally they thought, well, we can use protests, fine, and then we can file lawsuits, right? And the judiciary can take action, as your two main strategies. So they were using the protests and they were using the lawsuits, but then the KMT and TVP went to block the Constitutional Court from functioning. So the judicial lawsuit avenue was closed off. So then it became a potential constitutional crisis, and that's, I think, what pushed people over the edge. There were already people talking about recalls before that, but I think that's what convinced people that recall was the only way to go. Do you have anything to add, William?
Yeah, I think echoing what Bo has already talked about, one of the very important trigger points that led to the initial mass protest outside the legislature in late May and early June 2024 was in fact the way that these controversial bills were being introduced. And there were a lot of problematic procedural practices, including the opposition parties using their combined majority to basically shut down any cross-party deliberation and negotiation process, and seemingly, I think, hijacking these sessions, or using, I think, in some cases, physical ability to block out the ruling party lawmakers from, like either preventing them from making it to the stage, and then using, like, passing some of these measures within 3 minutes, which is astonishingly, I think, in a lot of the Taiwanese people's views, unprofessional. And so that really triggered the widespread civil society anger that led to a lot of the, later on, I think, public demand for these bills to be at least stalled, and then, go through more cross-party negotiation and deliberation, including, clause by clause. But then the opposition party decided to push ahead in a very determined way. And I think that really just planted the seeds that led to these later on, the initially targeted, but then later on, it was a very widespread, I think, recall campaign. And then I think another part of that was right after some of these controversial bills were being passed, a group of the lawmakers from the opposition Kuomintang party made a trip to China, and then came back and then passed further controversial bills that try to redistribute the government, central government budget to, allow the local government to have more control over budgets. That basically, I think, it's redistributing the national finance. And again, I think that was viewed as being insufficiently discussed and deliberated before it was, pushed through for the third reading. And then during those third reading processes, a lot of the times, opposition parties using their majority to force through these fast track a lot of these third readings. And so there were a lot of procedural flaws in the process that I think the general public believed that it was not sufficiently addressed.
Right. William makes a lot of good points, and he touched on some of the larger issue. Like, so yeah, they're pushing all these things through really fast. They're really controversial. They're using sort of dodgy procedures. This is all just fact, right? But then there's this impression that they were doing it in coordination with Beijing, and that impression took hold, and many Taiwanese people started to believe it. They started to really worry. I mean, it's no longer just like, oh, the two parties are fighting with each other. That's politics, whatever. It became more of a sense of national crisis. And that's what stimulated some of these, a lot of new volunteers to come out. The people that hadn't necessarily been involved in politics before thought, well, that's too much. Like, I don't care if the two parties are yelling at each other in parliament. That's whatever. But if there's somehow a plan that's worked out with Beijing, that's too dangerous for the country. So that's a lot of people started to have that sense of crisis. So on the one hand, there's a constitutional legal problem that the Constitutional Court is being blocked. And on the other hand, and the executive and the legislative branch are at loggerheads, kind of gridlock. But then there's this looming shadow of the Communist Party. Are they pulling strings? What are they doing? Somehow anything that makes Taiwan weak somehow benefits them. So even if they're not doing it on purpose, it seems like it's benefiting them. So people were starting to get very concerned about that.
Okay. Now, just going to the recall vote itself. No, I understand that before one goes into a recall vote, there are steps before you get a legislator under a recall vote, and 24 of them underwent a recall vote on July 26 but failed. I think there is a sense that there is a momentum there, but then when it came to the actual vote itself, it failed. Why do you think that happened?
I mean, there's tons of reasons. We'll probably both have to talk for 10 minutes each on this. But I think again, some of your viewers maybe aren't quite so familiar with recalling. So it's actually a 3-stage process, and the first 2 stages are involving signature collection. So there's an initial stage. You have to get 1% of voters in the district to agree that there should be a recall proposal. And then after that's certified, then you have 60 days to collect 10% of the voters in the district signatures. That's quite a lot of signatures.
Yes.
They collected something like well over 1 million signatures were collected, basically. I don't know the exact number, but out of a population of 23 million, it's like 1 in 20 Taiwanese, more than that because registered voters, right? So more than 1 in 20 registered voters, maybe 1 in 10 or 12 registered voters signed up, and they had to sign in a very specific format. It has to be verified. It's quite an immense procedure to collect these signatures. But even at that stage, you're still in the stage of like civil society, like, you've got volunteers on the street collecting signatures, right? That's the method of operation. And because of all these factors that we just discussed, there were a lot of volunteers that became very dedicated to this cause, and they were spending all their time doing it. And a lot of voters were going along with it and saying, yes, this is a national crisis. I'm willing to put my name down. They got the signature thresholds. But then the third stage is you go back to the whole electorate, right?
Yes.
So all the people who didn't sign get a chance to participate, right? And at the last stage. And so what it turned out was that, so they originally targeted, we have to discuss the great recall aspect of it in a separate question, but they originally targeted all 37 district members of from the KMT. Just a footnote, you can't target people who are national constituency because then you'd have to get the nationwide signatures. It doesn't work. The recall logic only works in a district election. So the TPP couldn't be targeted because none of their members are district members. And the KMT's nationwide party list members could not be targeted either. So they targeted all 37. Only 2 failed at the 1% stage. So they got the 1% in 35 districts. And then they got the 10% in 31 districts. And so that's what so those are going to vote. And it just happened that 7 of them took a bit longer. So they're happening 4 weeks later. They're actually going to the polls 4 weeks later. The original idea was that they would all go on the same day, but for technical reasons of signature collection, it took a bit longer. So that's why there's this extra mini wave on August 23rd. So, you can say the first stage was almost 100% successful. The second stage was like 90% successful. And then the third stage was 0% successful. So it's quite interesting. So the first 2 stages were highly successful. And then the third stage was a shutout, a complete non-success. So what does that say? But part of it, the understanding of it is that it's 2 different things going on. Both the first stages involve the civil society signature collection mode. And as long as you have a group of very committed people, you can do it. In the second stage, you just get the ordinary voters show up to vote. Or not. They could choose not to show up, right? And so in that case, the KMT was able to use their traditional get out the vote methods that any successful political party in a democracy is good at, getting their people to the polls, right? So they had their ways of getting their voters to the polls. And these are all districts that the KMT had won at the last election. And most of them they have been winning consistently for many cycles, right? So they could, they had a solid block of votes. If they could convince them to show up to the vote, they would win. And they did. The short answer, we can discuss how they did it, but the short answer is they successfully convinced all their original voters that they got to show up again to save their member. And that's what happened.
Brilliant.
And I think to further add to what Bo has already laid out was the fact that the ruling party's strategy in how it wants to play a role in the whole process was a little bit, I think, awkward throughout the entire time. Because in the very beginning, as these different districts citizens start to organize among themselves and begin the 2 stages of the signature collecting process, The initial reaction and the strategy from the ruling party was to keep a distance between themselves and the citizens that are initiating these signature collection, because they don't want to be, this whole process to be viewed immediately as the ruling party using this process as a way to seek retribution against these opposition lawmakers. And obviously, I think as the dozens of the districts then enter into the pass the threshold, enter into the third stage voting, and then I think the paradigms went back to the more traditional electoral political side of the matter, and that would then really require, I think, a more organized political entity like a major political party to come in and support these really citizen initiated movements that at the end of the day were still very much scattered, because they were only supposed to be targeting at the mobilizing signature collection process. But then, at once they started to want to get involved, there was, I think, some I think lack of clear communication and coordination between the ruling party and the citizens groups about how to share the responsibility. I think the communication within the ruling party was also very messy. Some members think that they should already be all in and stand side by side with the ruling party, with the citizens, but some others remain very reluctant to do that. And so, in the end, the lack of clear strategy and the very late in the game, kind of like using their party ability and organization to support these citizens to try to mobilize the turnout failed in these districts that already were not in their favor to begin with. And so I think that's why we saw a disconnection between the very I think optimistic outlook in the first two stages, and then leading up to the third stage versus the final outcome. I think there is a disparity between the level of the effort that the opposition parties put in versus the strategy that the ruling party put in. The opposition party, the two parties basically combine all their forces together in a very coordinated way, probably for the first time since they tried this method. And then it was very successful. They elevated all these district elections basically to the national level kind of election, kind of put turnout, mobilization, resource, outpour. But for the ruling party, again, it was very messy. It was clearly not entirely committed. There was a lot of fragmentation within its strategies and communications. And so in the end, it was also identified as one of the big factors that contributed to the falling short of reaching the goals of recalling any of the seats, I think.
Yes. I just have a
Yeah,
follow
well,
up.
yeah.
Yes, Bo.
Oh, well, maybe your follow up is the same thing. What is your follow up? Let's see.
No, I was just also curious, no, because I've read reports about it, and some of the reports say that the recall efforts was backed by DPP themselves. So I'm just curious, no, why stop short of supporting the efforts during the actual recall vote itself? Because no
Right.
matter how you put it, they stand to benefit from the result if it becomes positive towards those seeking to recall the legislators. So I'm just curious about why is
Well,
it that when it came to the actual vote, they did not
right.
deliver.
Right. I mean, so yeah, your follow up is related to what I was going to say. So that and William was correct that the position is quite awkward of the DVP, and so it's awkward. The specific awkwardness of it is they were involved enough
Mm,
that the opposition was able to paint this as a DVP led orchestrated thing and tell their voters that it was an orchestrated thing by the DVP, and it was believable, right? So the DVP, enough individual DVP members, I think William pointed out correctly, every individual DVP member just decided for themselves how much they wanted to get involved, and some got very involved, and some didn't get involved at all, right? And But the fact that there was this scattering of people who were notably involved was enough to allow the opposition party to blame the whole thing on the DPP and say this is all a DPP trick to overturn the results of the last election, and use that as their main campaign theme. So the DPP did enough at the beginning to make that strategy work, but they didn't do enough of the actual groundwork, mobilization, getting people to the polls to make any of them successful. So they did enough to get blamed, but not enough to get any good results. So it's it's sort of a terrible position. You get the worst of both worlds in a way. But it proved the fact that they were so discoordinated actually proves that the KMT's theory that this whole thing was a DPP trick is not true, right? I mean, if it's all a DPP trick, it would have been beautifully coordinated.
Yeah.
And it really wasn't beautifully coordinated. So yeah. But they were able to successfully portray it in their campaign. You know, there's a short campaign season, and they were able to just push this message out successfully to their voters and convince their voters that they've got to come to the polls again, because otherwise the DPP trick will be successful. And that worked. That was their main campaign strategy, which took the focus away from any of the individual legislators.
Yes.
Right? All of these individual legislators, you know, on every party in every country in the world, they've all got their problems and faults and things, right? So, but instead of the campaigns being about why should so-and-so keep his job, the campaign was about, we've got to stop this DPP trick. And that was a successful campaign for their side.
No, just going back to what William said earlier about the recall vote, it being a checks and balance mechanism. So from your insights today, it appears that it is more of individuals and groups seeking redress for officials who are not in line with probably policies that they want to push, or they are against the policies that these legislators are pushing for. Going back to what has been said about the efforts, there were criticisms that the recall campaign was an abuse of a process that should be used sparingly. Understanding that stakeholders use the mechanism in response to unpopular legislative and policy actions. I'm just also curious, are there other available mechanisms for ordinary citizens to effectively air grievances and shape public policy making of elected officials?
I don't think there are mechanisms that can actually directly allow them to, I think, challenge the unpopular, especially I think if it's a legislation that has already passed a third reading. And I think that's why the recall has served as a mechanism in the past, I think, like you mentioned, sparingly to target very particular or specific politicians that are viewed as failing to address the primary concerns of a particular group of voters from a particular district. In the past, we saw one of the most successful example was, in fact, the recall of the current speaker of the legislature when he was the mayor of Kaohsiung. He, once he took office, he, very soon, less than a year, announced that he was going to run for president, and that already, set off a huge public discontent about him. And then a lot of the during his campaign process, there were a series of unpopular policies or I think decisions made by him, and so the people decided to take him to a recall, and he was recalled. He was one of the few that actually was recalled. And so I think that again shows that this, within the very short, a little bit less than 3 decades of Taiwan's democratic history, the recall mechanism or the whole, I think, electoral political process is still, I think, stage of some parts of it is still in the stage of experimentation. It hasn't been used in a very institutionalized way. And so it goes back to why this recall was being applied in this way. Obviously, I think it was also one of the catalysts for this sweeping recall was because the leading lawmaker from the DPP opened the Pandora's box and promised, famously said during one of the legislative sessions that all of you are going to be recalled. And I think that set off this idea that actually the citizens realized, oh, we might be able to actually target more than just a few or one of them, and we can try to target a large group of them. And so I think then the citizens take over again this calling from the most senior lawmaker from the DPP, and then they did it among themselves. But because this most senior lawmaker continued to feature very promisingly in the public opinions arena, and so that led to the impression that the DPP was, one of the main sponsors behind it, driving this whole signature collection process, and the opposition was able to use it to sort of like put forward this idea and also this campaign strategy. And kind of expanding from what Bo said, beyond just mobilizing their core supporters, it in fact resonates quite a bit with some undecided voters, because then I think the longer that the opposition party was pushing and promoting this strategy, and the longer that the lack of a very also clear line of counter pushback from the ruling party, then really creates this, I think, belief that this is the ruling party somehow is involved, and this is not the right way that recall should be used. And so I think in the end, more undecided voters with no political affiliation whatsoever think that they don't prefer recalls being used in such a way, right? And so they decided to vote against it. But I think one of the most important points that need to be made is that their decision of supporting not recalling these opposition lawmakers does not represent the rejection of the overall, like it doesn't say that they approve what they have witnessed these opposition lawmakers have done in the legislature. Rather, I think probably the concern remains, but they just felt like there should probably be a more, like, less, I think, in their view, like a detrimental process, detrimental to the civil society overall, that can, actually lead to a different outcome, or rein in these lawmakers, or at least like let them feel the public's pressure, rather than using this from their perspective. I think it's a very brute force kind of way to just take them out of the picture and kick them out of the office that they were elected to in the first place.
That's interesting.
It is interesting. The whole, there's so many facets to this. We haven't even touched on the other side of the recall of it, but just on this point. So in hindsight, it probably would have been a more clever strategy to just single out, say, 6 or 8 or 10 of the most notorious extreme KMT members, and just focus on them. And if they had done that, the KMT would have been forced to defend these people's individual practices, which in many cases were not awesome looking, and there are some pretty bad looking things going on there, like the guy who was shaking hands in Beijing. You could target these people indirectly and force the KMT to defend them as individuals. So here's the thing. So there was no coordinated master strategy. This is the point. So, the actual leader of the DPP has said nothing about the recalls, but then this one senior guy that William mentioned goes all gung ho, like, yeah, let's take them all out. And then, but the other thing is that, here are these civil society groups, and if some volunteer, so originally they had already, the very senior civil society leaders had this idea of focusing on certain people at the beginning. In the middle of last year, they say we're going to have to recall some of these people, especially this one guy who is the KMT whip, who is orchestrating these trips to Beijing and stuff. We say this guy's got to be recalled. So they already had in mind him and a few others, right?
Yeah.
But when the volunteers from the other districts, who are involved in the protests, when they say, "Hey, I want to do my guy too," nobody can say, "No, you can't," right? Well,
Yes.
what can you do? You say, "Oh, well, yeah, if you want to try, go ahead," right? And then they're going ahead, and because this became a momentum thing that they swept through and actually succeeded in all of these almost all of these cases, 31 out of 35. And it's just kind of amazing. So there was nobody to say no to these people. That's nice. And there's another technical aspect for people who are like, ANFREL members who are maybe election nerds, interested in these kind of electoral systems, right? So the KMT tried to shut down the recalls legally. So they passed these amendment to the procedure of recalls, so basically there aren't going to be any recalls in the future in Taiwan because the KMT has already shut them down. And they passed the amendment to make the signature collections just about impossible. They can't take it away completely because it's in the ROC constitution, but they make it they added technical requirements to the signature collections that are so difficult that it's almost impossible for any recalls to pass again. And the only thing, the kind of funny thing, the government was able to delay the implementation of that legislation for a few weeks to February 20th. They're legally allowed to do that. That's the veto power in Taiwan, and it's very weak. All it means is you can delay a piece of legislation for a certain number of weeks. So they did that. The new law went into effect on February 20th, and the recall window opened on February 1st because you have to be in office for a full year before you can be recalled. So it's February 1st. So there was a 3-week window, 20-day window, and it was like, if you're ever going to do a recall in your life, this is your one and only chance, because in the future recalls will be blocked. Yeah. So that made another big push. We've got to try every one of them because we'll never get a chance again. And so that made it like, it was already growing. It was already from like 6 to then it was 16, and then it was like 26, and then finally it was like, no, we've got to try every single one, and we've got to do it before February 20th. So there was this big push to get that thing there. And interestingly, to illustrate this dynamic, on the other side, the KMT had the same thing. Yeah. They had this idea that they were going to do revenge recalls. And then when they realized the same thing, they realized, oh my God, if we're going to do these revenge recalls, we've got to do them before February 20th. So they rushed through. They tried to do 22 recalls also, and they tried to rush them through by February 20th. And they ended up failing in the signature collection stage because it was too rushed and too messy. And there was a lot of procedural flaws about that, which is another story. But the point is that they felt that pressure from the February 20th deadline as well, that they said, oh my God, if we're going to do any revenge recalls, we have to do them right now because we were not going to get a chance later in the year. So there was a pressure on both sides to push through as many recalls as possible before that February 20th deadline came down, because the KMT changed the laws to shut down recalls.
Yes.
So it's quite interesting.
I only have one last question left, but before my last question, as I've mentioned earlier, there are 7 more who are going to undergo the recall votes. I wanted to ask the two of you, what would be the outlook for that? Because it is in the coming weeks going to happen. And from the lessons that they've probably picked up from the last one, what could be the outlook for this upcoming recall vote?
None of these are going to be recalled. These are already even more difficult districts.
Right.
The reason why they took longer for the signature collection was exactly because these are districts that the KMT lawmakers, in fact, didn't really have too many, some of them have, but I think, they all are very, very popular and have long had local ties in these districts that it was never going to be very easy to even pass the second round threshold to begin with. So I think, and at the same time, the public sentiment and public feeling extending from the first round of the recall is still quite strong, because unfortunately, I think in between these few weeks, the domestic political environment has been challenging for the ruling party, with natural disasters, the government's erratic responses to that, and then the external factors coming in from the United States, where the pressure of the outcome of the tariff, and then how the government also communicated that with the public also created more problems for themselves, and also allowed the opposition parties to have more, I think, targets to hit, and they've been hitting them. And those have really, I think, diluted the public's focus on these recalls. I think if you ask Taiwanese people on the street these days, most of them are not probably even thinking about these recalls anymore, because their minds have been occupied by a lot of these political developments that have taken over the public's awareness and the attention.
Yeah, I mean, that has to be. It would be surprising if any of them went through, really. And the KMT has also. Their strategy. They figured out a strategy that works for defeating these recalls, and so they're just going to run it again. It would be a mistake by the KMT if they like got complacent and decided, oh, it's so easy to win, we don't have to. And the party headquarters is running off busy to do something else, and forgets to take care of something in some other district. I mean, it would be a mistake like that, but they probably won't make. I mean, you wouldn't put any money on them losing any of them. Yeah.
Okay. So for my last question, Taiwan will hold local elections next year and its presidential election in 2028. How could these recall efforts affect those elections? And what could these recall efforts and their results mean for the democracy in Taiwan?
I don't have much to say about the local election. I think it's not very directly related. I mean, there's always a swing. Historically in Taiwan, there's always been a sort of a pendulum effect. Like, whoever does well in the national election does poorly in the next local election, and vice versa. But I mean, I think this is just, if the recalls had been successful, it would have shaken things up and had ripple effects into the next election. But since it's more or less just reconfirming the election from last time, I don't think it has that much effect. Of course, the ruling party's general issues, some of which William just mentioned, are going to be playing out. And if it's going to be things like what's happening with the economy, and what's happening with U.S. relations with the U.S., and what's happening with relations with China, all these issues are going to be the issues that are driving the local elections, not so much what happened in the recall. It'll be sort of like water under the bridge, I think.
Right. I think, expanding from what Bo said, one interesting thing to look out for, though, is how the two opposition parties try to continue to experiment their combined, their ability to join forces in key areas and key local constituents going forward. They're already, I think, testing that out right now. There's going to be a very long and probably quite messy process to coordinate among themselves about, if this is a very important local seat, who are they going to try to put forward to run against the ruling party? And so that's going to be, I think, the more relevant to the recall, because we saw really they were successful, very successful in joining forces and having this common target or common enemy from their view, which is the ruling party. There's no conflict of interest in these recall races. But for the local elections, that will be quite different, because both parties will have to consider about their party's own future, their, like how big of a support base can they actually extract from these local elections, and then that, I think, process would then have consequences and implications for the national election in 2028. But I think one silver lining and very important lesson that the ruling party will have to tackle going forward really is how do they internally coordinate better and formulate and then find that unity. Because I think, to be honest, this recall process exposed the fragmentation that has been going on and plaguing them, I think, since President Lai took office in May 2024. They've been not able to, at the cabinet level, at the party level, even within the legislature, among the legislators that they have, they struggle, I think, to put forward convincing, united messages that catch the public's attention and really address the public concern. Public communication has continued to be a pillar in their strategy that really often drag down their efforts in the end. And I think that's going to be an area that, from this recall, the biggest lesson that they need to start really seriously tackling, rather than continue letting these fragmentations to undermine their ability to find that rhythm to get back into the game, the electoral game that are upcoming. Because I think right now they're still in that soul searching process. There's a lot of, I think, domestic internal struggle, chaos, and different opinions bumping around frictions. I think that process is going to take a while for them to really sort out and settle all those different opinions and different inputs and find a path forward. And I think right now that path seems quite murky at the moment because of the, different conclusions that people have drawn from the recall election.
Just
I second most of that, but I would add that just a little bit of historical perspective on this. The DPP has always been a party that was considered to be messy and and discombobulated and full of all kinds of people with fizzling with all kinds of different directions. It has always been like that, and people have always written it off and said, "Oh, look, it's so chaotic. It's such a floppy mess." And they've historically that has been actually a strength. So they look like they're completely in chaos, but it turns out to be a strength. And I think that strength will show through. And because the recall election was such a failure, it'll be a shock to the system. It will force them to come together at the next election. Conversely, if the recall had been relatively successful, they would have been worried. They would have been thinking about the by-elections. They would have been thinking about this and that, and they wouldn't be doing that soul searching right now. But the DPP always does their soul searching very openly, so everybody sees all kinds of noise and all kinds of different opinions coming here and there. That's the way they do their soul searching. So we'll see. It's way too early to write anybody off, but I think they're likely to be push towards greater strength because of because of this particular failure at the recall election. Yeah.
just before I let the two of you go, no, because Bo, you've mentioned earlier that as a response to the massive recall campaign, the legislators passed a harder way for people to recall legislators. So I think it's more of a response to what of that to that campaign. So in terms of policy making, that is, I would see it as something reactionary and makes it more difficult to hold people accountable, to address grievances, and for these mechanisms of checks and balance to be more difficult and less accessible to people. So I guess I just wanted to get your insight about how wh- what that what that means, and in terms of policy making and in terms of how politics play out in these kinds of mechanism. How does that affect people's way to hold their officials, voted public officials accountable?
Yeah, I mean, the recall is going to, for the time being, it's going to disappear in Taiwan.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, having flowered so magnificently will now then disappear completely.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit like, too much in one direction and then too much in the other direction. The pendulum swung too far in the other direction, and sooner or later it'll get pushed back towards something in the middle. Um, this design of the recall system. I mean, I think it's really interesting to study, and I hope people in other Asian countries are going to study it. As a possible mechanism. If you don't have elections very often, a 4-year term is pretty long. Um, you might want to, if the voters are. So the original idea of the recall is that the original voters who elected the person regret it for some reason. And it could be that they had a scandal, or it could be that they made a major policy U-turn. It could be that in some countries, they jump parties or they jump alliances or something like this. And then the voters like, wait, I'm part of this alliance. Why is my guy suddenly in that alliance? And in a situation like that, a recall can be a useful tool. Just, normally you wait till the next election, right? Say, okay, I don't like this guy anymore. I'm going to wait till the next election. But if the situation is relatively extreme, you might not want to wait till the next election. You might want to get him out in the middle of the term. And so the recall, examine it, in the case of a corruption scandal, right? Corruption scandal breaks out, but usually in most countries, it takes years to go through the judicial system. And in most countries, you don't lose your seat until sometime at the end of the judicial process, after you've been finally convicted or sentenced to jail or something. Sometimes not even then. In some countries, you still don't lose your seat. So this is the kind of thing where the voters can say, look, I don't care whether he gets off on a technicality in 5 years' time. I don't want him representing me now. I could take him out and replace him with somebody else, even from the same party, right? So you could get a different personality from the same party. So in that case, you don't like the person, but you can get somebody who has a similar policy framework, but who's cleaner, who is not involved in such a scandal. Or, as I said, if he jumps system. So that's what the recall is really for. And I hope that it'll come back in Taiwan and in the future. And I hope that other countries in Asia will think about it too, at least consider ideas. But you have to design it. So this whole thing about like the technical things, they sound very technical, but they actually make a big difference. Whether if it's too easy to use, that's not good. But if it's too hard to use, it's also not good. You have to get the right balance. That makes it possible to use, but it's not going to happen every day either. So, that's what. And Taiwan is swinging. I don't think it was too easy to use. It was quite hard to use this time around. It was surprising that it could be done that well. I think they had it about right, the balance. And this 25% threshold thing, some people said it should be more, some people said it should be less. Yeah, it's maybe about right, 25% threshold. It seems reasonable to me. It used to be more, and the leader of the TPP used to say it should be less, it should be 0. And now he says recalls are dangerous. I don't know. That's a very odd story, but I just think for people who are interested in electoral systems, this is a way to do a kind of midterm accountability, like other than the big accountability every 4 years or however many years it is in your country. You can have this midterm mechanism.
How about you, William?
I think I agree with Bo, but I'm a little bit more pessimistic regarding the amendments that were passed by the opposition lawmakers. That it basically, like Bo said, it essentially is now ruling out this as a mechanism, and I do worry a little bit about how, without this, I think particular measure to for people to be able to channel their discontent and exercise their rights, given the level of polarization right now within Taiwan, it is less ideal. I think it will reduce an important outlet for the public to have more healthy way to participate in politics. And what we might see going forward is, unfortunately, even more, I think, targeted political campaign strategies that will rile up public sentiment, public opinion, and then allow those to dictate how each election goes. And I think, given oftentimes how issues, I think very trending issues like relations with China, for example, engagement, relationship with the United States, or like Taiwan's economy, for example, can easily blow up into something that will be, I think, tainted with like a disinformation or like wrong, untrue of like claims. That's, I think, going to be a challenge that, unfortunately, without the recall, the public will not be able to have a better way to really allow the politicians to hear their true opinions and what they really think about them and their performances.
Yeah, that's a
Okay.
really good point. I forget who I heard. I forget who it was, but one commentator on the recalls made a really interesting point. They said, compare the situation in Taiwan to the situation in South Korea. Where the president and the legislature were at a deadlock, and the president ended up trying to declare martial law, and
Yeah.
creating this terrible situation, sending troops to the parliament.
Mhm.
So it's so much better to just have a recall campaign, right? So this is a democratic, peaceful, and legal mechanism. So all this anger and channel, at the legislature, this public anger that people were feeling had an outlet. It had a channel
Yes.
that you
Yes.
could go. You could say, "Oh, if you're that angry, well, here's your signature form. Go get signatures."
Yes.
And it channeled it into a super peaceful and very legal method. And at the and after this whole process, and then it fails, the anger. I mean, people are disappointed and they're sad, but in a way, their anger has had a chance to be heard.
Yes.
And if that can't exist in the future, then we may end up using other forms which are less ideal. So, yeah.
Okay. So those were I've asked all my questions. But thank you, William and Bo, for joining us today. Thank you for the very interesting and helpful insights as well on the Great Recall campaign in Taiwan. I would have to hide you from the stream to formally close the show, but again, thank you for joining us in this episode.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks to ANFREL. Yeah.
Yes. And that has been the Election Observer podcast on what the results of the Great Recall campaign in Taiwan mean moving forward and how the recall efforts affect the overall health of democracy in Taiwan. Get the latest news and updates about ANFREL programs and activities through our Facebook, X, LinkedIn, and TikTok pages. You can also subscribe to our YouTube and WhatsApp channels. Please follow the Election Observer podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you for joining us again today. I'm your host, John Antiquera. Have a great day, everyone. Bye.